Descending order of priority. So like obviously beef liver has gotten a lot of hype lately from Liver King. I think before that I had already kind of understood too that it was like, like nature's multivitamin I had heard for years. That was kind of what compelled me to incorporate it into my diet. And when you're only having an ounce a day too, like it's not that bad. Even if you don't like the taste, it's pretty easy to just, it takes like 2 seconds to eat. So in descending order of if you were to have somebody like upgrade their diet and introduce these organ meats into their system, is like beef liver the kind of like go-to like totem pole thing that you would have at the top, and then in descending order under that, are there organs that you would recommend like as 2, 3, 4, or is there kind of like a system that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, there's a system, and that's just kind of like the paradigm that I have in my mind that's maybe based on my experiences with hunter-gatherer tribes and the nutritional quality of various organs. I think liver is the great place to start. I think, like you said, you asked this question, I got distracted from it, but you asked what's an effective dose. I think an ounce of liver or even half an ounce of liver per day is an effective dose. It's so high in things like choline, vitamin A, K2, selenium, zinc, copper to balance the zinc, that even a half ounce of liver a day is going to be effective for people. And if you eat half an ounce of liver a day, you're at 3 to 4 ounces a week. That's amazing. That's great for people. And you don't need to get a whole lot more than that. And you mentioned vitamin A toxicity. We can touch on that for a second in a moment. But yeah, I think liver is the first one. Start with liver, whether it's fresh or desiccated. And if you do it fresh, know that the source matters. I would do something high quality from an animal, preferentially eating grass, finished on grass, preferably organic, preferably from a farm that you know the farmer. All raw organs have a risk of contamination. That's just how all raw foods do. Sushi, raw organs, everything has a risk of those things. So if you want to eat raw organs, great. If you have concerns about that stuff or you don't know your source, you can sear it on the outside, you can cook it, or you can do desiccated. But know that any raw organ, any raw food is always going to have a risk of contamination for humans.
Yeah, that's something we probably should tangent off before I forget. So the risk of contamination, foodborne illness, is like, I did a video recently. There was this guy who presumably is trying to kind of like bandwagon off the Liver King hype train, and he's like eating brains and raw eggs and stuff on camera, and he's just like I can't even tell if he likes it. Like, it seems like he's kind of cringing his way through it a little bit in order to like build a gimmick around it essentially. But still, like, I'm not discounting the viability of the nutrient density of the organ meats, but at the same time, is the ROI on the risk for eating like a raw brain versus cooking it, like, does it even make sense for the majority of people who don't necessarily know for a fact like where their stuff, like the sanitary practices and whatnot? And I don't know, a bunch of people were commenting that guy's video got like a shit ton of views, like 20 million views or something. Everyone was commenting about prions and like I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, we can talk about that too. So I don't know if there's any known prion diseases in the neural tissue of sheep and lamb. He was eating a lamb brain. I saw it. It's mostly in cows, like the bovine BSE is bovine spongiform encephalopathy. And that's real, but there's never been a case in New Zealand. So, but neural tissue is always a little bit concerning. The thing about prion disease is even if you eat that meat cooked, it doesn't change the prions, from what I understand. So like when they have had outbreaks of BSE in the UK, even cooked meat can be problematic, or cooked brain tissue can be problematic. So when you're cooking meat, or brains in this case, you'd essentially be destroying any bacteria on the surface of the brain. And right. that, like you said, is just have somebody wipe their butt and then touch this brain that they sent to you, right? Yeah. That's the main problem. Like, are you going to get Campylobacter or are you going to get Salmonella? Those are the two bacteria that you worry about with raw eggs as well. And so I think that for people, if they're worried about that kind of foodborne contamination with those GI-centric bacteria, yeah, cook your food, cook your liver. It's going to be on the outside of the liver. You can cook it. You can cook your eggs if you're worried about it. The other thing is parasites. I think there's not a lot of parasites in a brain, but there definitely occasionally are parasites in livers. If you get good liver from a cow that's grass-fed and grass-finished, and you're familiar with what liver looks like, that's pretty rare, especially if the liver's been pre-frozen. Now, if you look at the literature, you have to really freeze the liver for a long amount of time or a very deep freeze, the kind of freeze that nobody has in their house, the kind of freeze you find in like molecular biology labs, like -20, that will kill the parasites. But there's some indication that if you freeze the liver for 2 to 3 weeks, and a lot of the liver you might get from like a farm may have been frozen for a few weeks, that's going to decrease the incidence of parasites in the liver. But again, if you're worried about that stuff, just cook the liver or get desiccated. Again, prions, cooking won't change anything. So if you want to eat brains, you're just going to take the risk. Not a lot of brain risk with, I think, sheep or lamb. I ate monkey brains when I was in Africa, and I didn't tell many people about it, but I texted Joe Rogan. He was like, you're crazy. You're going to get prion disease. And I looked it up, and there's not a whole lot of incidents of that kind of stuff. But I was in Africa with the freaking Hadza, and we killed a baboon.
Yeah, obviously you're going to do whatever you're
going to do it, man. I want to have that experience. If I get prion disease, then I lived a good life. And, I start slurring and drooling out of my mouth. And that was the end of Paul, but he lived well, live fast, die young. So yeah. So that was the tangent there. I'll go back and finish the organ hierarchy if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Liver. Then I like heart as the next one. Heart can even be the first organ people eat because it's so much like muscle meat. And if you get a good slice, it's just going to taste a lot like muscle meat, not going to be super gamey. Heart is great for coenzyme Q10, anserine, taurine. Heart is actually a really good source of riboflavin, which is one of these B vitamins that I don't think gets enough attention. People think about folate, but riboflavin is key. And I imagine your audience is savvy because you talk a lot about this stuff on your podcast, but we can get a little geeky here for one moment. There's this polymorphism, the MTHFR polymorphism, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase polymorphism. I have it. There's 677C to T and 1298. I am homozygous for the 677 polymorphism.
Seems like a lot of Italians.
It is a lot of Italians, and I believe Hispanics as well. Yeah. But what you find in the literature is that if you get a slightly the recommended, like if you get slightly above the recommendation for riboflavin every day, if you get 1 or even 1.5 or 2 milligrams of riboflavin every day in your diet, there's some allosteric regulation of that MTHFR enzyme, and you can normalize your homocysteine, which is the reason that you're worried about that MTHFR, by getting good amounts of riboflavin in your diet. But then the question becomes, where do we get riboflavin? Basically, liver and heart are the best sources. A little bit in egg yolks, a little bit in egg whites, but it's pretty rare in the plant kingdom to get bioavailable real riboflavin. So this is another key thing with heart. So
yeah, I forget what the interaction was, but a while ago when I was digging into genetics and all my SNPs and whatnot for the first time, I found like I'm homozygous C677T MTHFR. Yeah. So I have like the most impairment of methylation, and obviously genetically, it comes from my mom's side, who's Italian. She has the same thing, and she found that riboflavin supplementation, I believe it was riboflavin, actually improved her migraine occurrence like pretty significantly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, there's good evidence that that's really big doses of riboflavin for migraines, like 300 milligrams. But even 3 or 5 milligrams a day of riboflavin just from food could affect homocysteine and MTHFR. But yes, there's something going on with like big doses of riboflavin for migraines.
For the heart, when you say like it's full of like CoQ10, for example, like, do you know how to extrapolate out for example, a supplemental CoQ10 soft gel might be like 100 to 200 or something. Like how do you like quantify how much heart is there even a way to when you're eating the heart?
You can look at this is why nutrition is both fascinating and endlessly frustrating. Yeah. You can look at heart muscle and they'll quantify how much CoQ10 is in there, and they'll tell you, but you wonder like, okay, this is in a food matrix. Is it going to be bioavailable and more or less? You hope it is. It's hard to actually do the studies. So I just, when you look at the organs, heart is the highest that I've seen in coenzyme Q10. Yeah. And it's hard to know how bioavailable that is versus a soft gel. When I've done anecdotally in my practice and with myself, when I've looked at my CoQ10 levels in the blood on people who focus on meat and organs, they're high. They're robust. They're very robust. They're like maybe 3 to 4 standard deviations above the mean because they're outside of the reference range above where they, what people expect. They don't see these on normal people, this level of CoQ10.
Right. So like you mentioned bioavailability, and circling back to the raw meat, we will get back to the hierarchy because I definitely do want to go through that. But the cooking thing, some people like there's some meats, for example, people will assert that the bioavailability of the protein is enhanced when you cook it versus when you have it raw, you're actually losing out. But then on the other side of the spectrum, you'd be thinking with something as nutrient dense as liver, if I can retain even like all of the nutrients and not cook out any of them, if there was a chance that you'd lose some of the quality, like why would I take that risk? You know, like, is there certain foods that you should cook, like eggs, for example, with, you know, neutralizing the avidin component relative to meats? Is raw, like, you know, a more ideal potentially, or like, what do you think on that?
This is such an interesting question now. You know, there's this guy on Instagram doing this raw meat thing, and people are talking about this a lot. One of the reasons that I like to eat raw liver was just this idea, like, okay, I'm going to get all the riboflavin, all the potentially heat labile nutrients. I'm trusting the source. I've never gotten sick in my experience, my N of 1 from raw liver. I'll do an ounce, half an ounce a day, but that's why I do it raw. It's super easy. I don't have to cook it. I like it better, and it's preserving things. You know, I think that the majority of the literature points to the fact that when you cook foods, you will sacrifice some of the nutrients, not all, but some. And when you desiccate nutrients, when you freeze dry nutrients, you're going to lose some of the nutrients, but not all. And the trade-off is what appears to be increased protein digestibility. And there's a lot of studies on this, so it's hard to really look at all of them. But I think in terms of like pig guts and these other studies that have been done, Richard Wrangham has talked about this in the book Catching Fire. When you cook meat, it appears that the protein is more bioavailable for humans when you cook it. Now, having said that, I don't really like a well-done steak. So when I'm eating a steak, it's like cooked on the outside and raw on the inside. When I eat hamburgers, they're kind of the same way. So I'm getting both. You could also do the same thing with your liver if you wanted to sear the outside and leave the inside pink. But yeah, there's always this trade-off, nutrient bioavailability, at least in terms of heat labile nutrients. A lot of the B vitamins are probably denatured partially when you cook it. Vitamin C appears to be heat labile. And then protein availability and protein digestibility. You hit on a great thing with the egg whites. I would cook your egg whites because there is avidin. It does bind biotin. You are sort of creating this negative pull away from the B vitamins with the avidin and the egg white. I would cook it if you're going to eat the egg whites. Some people just, for a while, when I was eating more eggs, I would just separate and just eat the yolks because I found them interesting to eat raw and enjoyable and simple. The one thing I'll say about eggs is, from the data that I've seen, if you're getting an organic egg or a pasture-raised egg, if you know the quality, the incidence of the salmonella and the campylobacter on the shell is much lower. And that's where the contamination comes from. So if you crack the egg and there's contamination on the shell, if you keep the yolk membrane intact, the yolk has like a really thin membrane. And you know how you can like crack an egg, separate the white, it'll fall through your hand. The yolk will just sit in your hand. It looks really cool. It's like this little bubble. And it's just, it's not surface tension. There's actually a membrane on the yolk. And if you haven't cracked the yolk with a raw egg, the risk of contamination there is extremely low because the shell didn't even really touch the yolk. So that's one thing to consider. But I would cook your whites if you want to eat them. Does that answer some of your questions?
Yeah. Like, I've seen, when you actually look at it from like a molecular mass level, it seems like the amount of biotin from the yolk itself relative to the avidin content of the egg white surrounding it, you could otherwise just be like netting out like zero, where it's like you're not, I don't know, where it's like you could be at a net positive, but at the same time, like, it seems like the more reasonable approach is just to ensure you've neutralized the avidin component by cooking it adequately. I don't know.
At least for the white. And then you'd have to go through and look how heat labile is biotin in the yolk, how much, how much of the biotin in the yolk are you going to denature when you cook it? So, and I think a lot of people could also benefit from more biotin, which is one of the kind of overarching ideas. And that's the whole reason that I got interested in nose to tail eating and these hunter-gatherer cultures and eating organs or eggs, egg yolks, or anything in the first place. Like, are there nutrients like biotin or riboflavin or anserine or taurine or CoQ10 that we could really improve our overall nutrient status by sort of eating in a way that is apparently evolutionarily consistent?
What do you think about the like peptides and growth factors that could otherwise be denatured during cooking as well? Like, I know Liver King, one of his claims is, well, I don't know how like strongly he believes it or if he just does it as like an insurance policy, but he eats raw because he wants to retain these like growth factors that I'd be skeptical that they're even bioavailable to do something, actively. Whereas like typically that's like a, I don't know, paracrine function where you have like intracellular concentrations of hormones being produced, and just like eating it is not necessarily yielding like an active effect. So I would be skeptical that it even does anything, but I wanted to run it by you if you've looked into that at all, or if there's any viability.
It's interesting. Like, so BPC 157 occurs in the stomach and the intestines, or at least in the juices.
True.
And people do eat like mondongo, I think, is intestines. And then there's like all these other Latin American dishes that are intestines. I have intestines in my fridge in Costa Rica. And people do take BPC 157 orally. And I think it's mostly for gut issues, but who knows? I think the peptides are this wild west frontier where I would love to see more research on this. And we're just kind of guessing. We don't really know the answer there. You're absolutely right. Like, are they bioavailable? It's a peptide. It's 50 or less amino acids canonically. You're going to put that peptide into a stomach acid, which is less a pH of 1.5. Like, that peptide could get broken down, but it also could have effects in the stomach, or sometimes they do pass through the stomach intact. So who knows? It's very interesting. I remember reading some research about collagen peptides that perhaps, and I'd have to go back and actually dig into this in detail, that some of the peptides might actually pass through the stomach and they didn't get fully degraded. So I do think that's an interesting hypothesis. Like, maybe a little bit of raw organs every once in a while could give you some peptides that are valuable. I certainly think that the peptides in organs are fascinating. And I don't know how this research is going to happen, Derek, because I don't know who's going to fund it. But there was a little bit in the 50s and 60s and 70s. There was a guy named Jeffrey Bland who actually did this with rats, I think, and he used spleen extract and liver extract. And there were a couple of peptides in the spleen, tuftsin, splenin, and splenopentin. And he found that when he did desiccated or raw, they did seem to affect the rats. Now, this is a 1970s study that wasn't published in Nature or Cell or Science. So who knows? But there is some of that kind of like murky research from before you or I were born. That's intriguing, and it's never been repeated. The peptides in organ concentrates are kind of they're a black box. Like, could it be helpful for humans? Absolutely. Could it not have any effect on us? Yeah. I think hopefully we'll get some, I hope we get more into that in the future of nutrition.
Yeah. So circling back to the hierarchy. So we had liver at the top, secondarily, perhaps heart. And then below that,
I'll just tell you. So personally, I like testicle. Okay. There's interesting things in it, and it could just be all placebo, man. But I feel like there's a libido boost when you eat it. Have you ever had raw testicle?
No, but have you seen, like, you check your biomarkers pretty meticulously. Right. Have you seen a difference in your LH or FSH concentrations before and after? Or?
This trip to Texas, I'm going to get my blood work. Okay. And I've been eating raw testicle for like the last year because I can get a lot of it in Costa Rica. They just give me testicles. I can just go to the carniceria and buy 15 testicles. They're like, they don't know who this crazy gringo is who wants 15 testicles. But I'll tell you, I'll let you know after the pod, because I'm going to get my blood work done on this trip to Texas. I haven't done my blood work in about a year. It feels good. I'm like, okay, if I feel like I have more libido, that's positive. Who knows? Maybe there's boron in the testicle that's affecting things, but it could be a lot of different things. So I like testicles. People get grossed out by those. What other organs? I mean, brain has a lot of interesting research. There's actually good, solid research on prevention or reversal of like cognitive decline in the elderly with bovine brave derived phosphatidylserine. Right. So that's a pretty powerful thing. And I remember when we were developing our brain supplement, I was looking at a lot of that research and I was like, this is legit. Like, they're basically taking desiccated cow brains and giving them to people who have cognitive decline. And there seems to be some benefit. There's a lot of research about phosphatidylserine in general, and we definitely know that it's in the brain. So that's kind of an interesting one. And then you get into things like the intestines, the spleen, the pancreas, the kidneys are valuable. It all kind of starts to blur. And then who knows which one to choose. I just think it's interesting to eat as much in a variety and kind of see how you feel. And at least from what I've observed with hunter-gatherer cultures, they don't waste anything. Well, that's not true. They will give, they have these hunting dogs, and they'll give the stomach sometimes to the dogs, but definitely the intestines. So the intestines go to the dogs. They may clean out the stomach and eat the stomach, but everything else they eat the kidney, they eat the pancreas, they eat the liver, they eat the spleen, they eat the brain, they eat the eyes, they eat everything.
Damn. By the way, as far as blood work goes, I've Steven told me you were in touch with them for Merrick Health. I don't know if you're going to be
Yeah, yeah,
utilizing them for blood work, but that would be awesome if we were able to collaborate on that somehow.
yeah, absolutely. I'd love to.
Awesome. Killer. I'm looking forward to seeing the results.